Hey guys, tonight we're going on a quiet journey. Not to a place of headlines or modern borders, but to a time long before the names we know were ever spoken. We're traveling back thousands of years to a sliver of land nestled at the crossroads of empires, a place of sun-baked hills and a ribbon of coastline where the great powers of the ancient world met, traded, and clashed. Before it was Israel, before there were prophets and kingdoms, this land had another name, a name whispered in Egyptian hieroglyphs and pressed into Mesopotamian clay. They called it Canaan. Tonight, we'll walk through this forgotten world. We won't focus on the great battles or the fall of kings, but on the quiet, steady hum of life in some of the world's very first cities. We'll listen for the echoes of the people who called this land home, the Canaanitesa civilization that laid the foundations for so much of what was to come. So, find a comfortable position. Let your breathing slow. Our story begins not with a bang, but with the gentle turning of the earth and the first stirrings of settlement in a land that would one day help shape the world. If you enjoy these quiet journeys into the past, feel free to subscribe for more. Your presence here is what makes these travels possible. Now, let's continue, back to the dawn of civilization. Before the names came, before borders were drawn, or kingdoms were raised from stone, and ambition there was simply land. A stretch of wild earth cradled between seas. A terrain worn not by history books or foreign conquest, but by wind and rain, by sun and seasons. This was the land before Israel, before Canaan, before even memory dared to settle its roots. To speak of what Israel was before it was Israel, we must first let go of the names. We must step backward beyond the pages of Scripture, beyond the footprints of prophets, beyond the tablets of kings. We must drift quietly into an age when the land had no title, and its people no history, only presence. We return to the earliest breath of human existence, in a place destined to carry the weight of centuries. The land we now call Israel rests along the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, between the coastal plain and the mountains of Jordan. In that place, thousands upon thousands of years ago, before Abraham, before David, before Rome, there were the earliest people. Archaeologists call them Natufian hunter-gatherers who lived in the Levant between roughly 15,000 and 11,000 years ago. They did not have temples or towers. They had flint tools, bone ornaments, and the wisdom of watching the stars. These people did not build cities. They followed the migration of animals and the rhythm of wild crops. In caves near Mount Carmel, in valleys that later echoed with psalms and wars, they lived in silence. They were not Israelites. They were not even Canaanites. They had no knowledge of Torah, no thoughts of kingdoms or chosen lands. Their gods were the sun, the moon, the wind. Their histories were sung beside campfires, carved into bone, remembered in the curve of an ancestor's jaw. In the lush river valleys that would become the cradle of civilization, these early humans began to settle. The Jordan River, now dividing modern borders and sacred traditions, was once simply a source of water and fish. It fed into the Sea of Galilee, a calm blue basin encircled by hills that had not yet borne the weight of footsteps. From there, it trickled down into the vast Dead Sea, so rich in salt it refused to cradle life, yet shimmered like a mirror for the stars. The Dead Sea sat at the lowest point on Earth's surface. Even now, it remains still and heavy, absorbing the heat of summer and the secrets of history. But in that age before names, it was merely another part of the landed body of water to be avoided or cautiously touched. The earliest people camped near its edges, perhaps puzzled by its taste, perhaps content to watch it sparkle. As centuries passed, the Natufians slowly became something else. The rhythm of their lives changed. They stopped wandering quite so far. They planted barley. They gathered lentils. They buried their dead with care, placing tools and ornaments beside them, suggesting the beginnings of a belief that something lay beyond death or that memory itself was sacred. By 9000 BCE, the Neolithic Revolution was quietly underway. In places like Jericho, long before its walls would fall, the first permanent settlements began to take shape. Houses were built of mud brick. Granaries stored food against the lean months. Dogs were domesticated, pottery crafted, and communities born. This was not Israel. Not yet. But it was becoming something new. Jericho may be the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. Long before the shofar blew and the walls crumbled in biblical tales, it stood as a cluster of small homes, a watchtower of stone rising nearly 10 meters tall, and the murmur of human voices echoing in the early dawn. The people here were not Hebrews. They were not even Canaanites, but they were human, resilient, clever, and woven into the fabric of this place. Further north, settlements like Ain Ghazal in modern Jordan rose, where statues were crafted plaster figures with painted eyes, some over 3 feet tall. Were they gods, ancestors, watchers? We do not know, but they tell us that the people who lived here thought deeply about their world. They were not mindless. They were not primitive. They wondered. The land slowly transformed. Olive trees were cultivated. Goats and sheep grazed on sun-bleached hills. The first signs of what we might call civilization emerged not through conquest, but through patience, through the passing of seasons and the settling of minds. Between 5000 and 3000 BCE, the Chalcolithic period swept over the region. Copper tools appeared, along with more refined pottery. Burial practices became complex. Some tombs held multiple bodies, carefully arranged. Grave goods included jewelry, blades, and bolus objects, meant, perhaps, to accompany the dead into the unknown. And still, this was not Israel, but it was the land that would become Israel, and it bore the memory of each step, each breath, each burial. Around 3300 BCE, the Bronze Age dawned. Trade routes opened. Egypt cast its long shadow over the region. The coastal cities Acre, Ashkelon, Gaza flourished as trade ports. The inland hills, where Jerusalem would later rise, were sparsely populated but not empty. Farmers tilled rocky soil. Shepherds moved with their flocks. Small fortresses began to dot the landscape. It was during this time that the people we call Canaanites emerged. The Canaanites were not a unified nation. They were a collection of city-states, each ruled by its own king, each worshipping a variety of Godsel, Baal, Asherah. Their language, their religion, and their customs were rooted in the broader Semitic culture of the region. To Egyptian scribes and invading armies, Canaan was a land of tribute and turmoil. Its cities paid taxes, pledged loyalty, and rebelled in turn. The Amarna lettersclay tablets written in Akkadian record these dealings, with rulers of Canaanite cities pleading for help, warning of enemies, or boasting of loyalty. But beneath the political intrigue lay ordinary life. In the shadow of palace walls, people baked bread, mended fishing nets, told stories. They married, raised children, and passed on songs. They did not call themselves Canaanites. That name, like Israel, would be given by others. But they were here. They were part of the land. And as time passed, the memory of the Natufians faded. The earliest farmers and shepherds gave way to builders and traders. The cities grew. Roads formed. Altars were raised to forgotten gods. Then, somewhere around the 13th century BCE, whispers of a new people began to surface. Egyptian records speak of a group called the Habiru migrant laborers, mercenaries, or perhaps rebels. Their identity is debated. Some suggest they were the Hebrews, the ancestors of Israel. Others say they were simply outsiders, living on the margins of society. There is no clear boundary, no single moment where the past ended and Israel began. It was a slow unfolding, a dawn stretched across centuries. So what was Israel before it was Israel? It was a cradle of beginnings. It was a land shaped by silence, by footsteps, by unnamed prayers. It was a stage upon which many stories would be told, though none yet knew their line. It was people, ordinary, extraordinary people, who gathered water from wells, who buried their dead with care, who looked up at the same stars we now see, and wondered what might be waiting beyond the hills. Long before kingdoms rose and prophets cried out in the wilderness, there was a patchwork of cities and settlements, nestled among the hills and plains of the land that would one day be called Israel. These were the homes of the Canaanites. To speak of them is to turn our gaze to a time when belief was etched in stone, when every hill might have been holy, and when every city carried the scent of incense, earth, and fire. The name Canaan itself comes to us through layers of language Egyptian inscriptions, Akkadian tablets, and later Hebrew scripture. But the people of this land may not have called themselves Canaanites at all. Like many early peoples, their identity was fluid, their names local and varied. They were farmers, potters, metalworkers, herders. They built their homes from clay, mud brick, and wood. They traded up and down the coast and far into Mesopotamia and Egypt. Canaanite cities were not vast empires. They were modest yet bustling hubs. Places like Megiddo, Hazor, Gezer, and Lachish dotted the land. Each was ruled by a local king or chief. Each had its own temple, its own traditions, its own rhythms. Hazor in the north, perhaps the greatest of them, was once called the head of all those kingdoms. It sprawled across a hill, commanding the trade routes that snaked toward Syria. In its prime, Hazor held palaces, storage facilities, shrines, and homes where scribes pressed symbols into damp clay. To the south, Jerusalem was still young, not yet holy, a hilltop fortress perhaps, unnamed in the stories that would one day center it, but still there watching, waiting. The Canaanites worshipped a pantheon of gods. Chief among them was El, the father deity. His name would echo later in the Hebrew word for God El, Elohim. But to the Canaanites he was not alone. Baal, the storm god, rode the clouds and brought the rains. Asherah, the mother goddess, gave life to the fields and wombs alike. Anath, Resheph, Mot, and others filled the heavens with tales of battle, passion, and harvest. Their stories were preserved in the city of Ugarit, in what is now Syria. There, scribes wrote Canaanite myths in an early alphabet describing a world where gods fought for supremacy, where the cycles of nature were explained through divine drama. The death of Baal brought drought. His resurrection, the return of rain. In the land itself, these gods were honored at high places raised altars on hilltops or in inner sanctuaries of temples. Sacrifices were made, offerings left, incense burned to carry prayers upward. But Canaanite religion was not only ritual, it was woven into every act of life, the planting of grain, the drawing of water, the birth of a child. Each moment resonated with divine presence. Their language, a branch of Northwest Semitic, was an ancestor of both Hebrew and Phoenician. It echoed with the rhythms of daily life contracts, letters, prayers. Though we have few of their own voices preserved, traces survive in Egyptian records, in tablets buried beneath ash, in names passed down through the ages. Canaanite homes were often simpler rectangular rooms with flat roofs, earthen floors, and hearths for cooking. In cities, streets were narrow and winding. Courtyards were shared. Walls were thick to hold in coolness. Water was drawn from cisterns or wells, sometimes carved deep into bedrock. They worked with copper, bronze, and later iron. They shaped pottery with practiced hands. Some pieces were simple, utilitarian. Others bore decorations, wavy lines, dots, or stylized animals. Their economy was based on trade and agriculture, fields of barley and wheat, groves of olive trees, herds of goats and sheep. The coastal cities engaged in trade across the sea, exchanging local products for luxury goods, lapis from Afghanistan, cedar from Lebanon, silver from Anatolia. In war, the Canaanites fought with chariots and spears, though battles were likely small and seasonal. City-states raided each other, formed alliances, paid tribute to larger powers, especially Egypt, whose influence loomed large. From the 15th to 13th centuries BCE, Canaan was part of Egypt's New Kingdom Empire. Egyptian governors, called overseers, collected taxes and enforced the pharaoh's will. Egyptian gods and customs mingled with local ones. Temples bore images of Horus and Isis beside Baal and Asherah. But even under foreign influence, Canaanite culture endured. Their myths, rituals, and city life continued. They adapted, absorbed, and persisted. It is in this context, the Late Bronze Age, that the earliest Hebrews may have emerged, perhaps as nomads on the fringes, perhaps as migrants from the deserts, perhaps as rebels, escaping servitude in Egypt. The origins are unclear, but what is clear is that they entered a land already ancient, already sacred to many. Canaan was not a blank slate. It was not a void waiting to be filled. It was a living tapestry of belief, trade, community, and tradition. And it is from this soil that Israel would one day rise. But in this chapter, we remain with the Canaanites. We sit at their hearths. We walk their stone streets. We kneel at their shrines. We hear the chants of priests, the laughter of children, the clink of pottery in busy markets. This was the world before conquest, before commandments, before exile and return. It was a world of clay and stone, of sun and shadow, of gods both feared and loved. And though much of it has turned to dust, its spirit lingers. In every layer of soil beneath modern cities, in every myth that carried into scripture, in every name that echoes still. Long after the first stones were stacked to form cities, and long before the fires of empire scorched the hills, a quiet story began to stir, a whisper almost. Not yet a nation, not yet a people, but a family, a wandering household of tents and livestock, hopes and questions. This chapter begins not in Canaan, but far to the east, in a city called Ur. Ur was old, even then, a city of temples and merchants, sitting beside the slow-moving Euphrates River in what is now southern Iraq. There, beneath the shadow of ziggurats and in homes lined with bitumen and clay, a man named Abram was born. He was not yet a prophet, not yet a patriarch, just one man in a family, in a land full of gods and customs. But something stirred in him, or perhaps around him. According to tradition, a voice came, soft, firm, beyond understanding. It told him to leave. Go from your country, your people, and your father's household, to the land I will show you. And so he went. He left Ur behind. He traveled northwest with his father Terach and his wife Sarai. They stopped in Haran, in the northern reaches of Mesopotamia, where shepherds watched their flocks among the hills. Terach died there. Then Abram continued. He was 75 years old, the story says. No children, only promises. He moved not with armies, but with animals, camels, sheep, goats, servants, a small caravan of purpose and patience. He crossed rivers, skirted deserts, followed the trade routes used by merchants and messengers. And finally, he arrived in Canaan. The land was already full. Canaanite cities dotted the plains. Shrines to Baal and Asherah rose from hilltops. Fields were farmed, wells dug, kings crowned. But Abram did not seek conquest. He came as a guest, a stranger. He built no walls. He claimed no throne. He pitched his tents in Shechem first, between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. There, he built an altar to the voice that had guided him, a quiet altar, just stones and belief. He moved on to Bethel, then to the Negev. At times, he traveled to Egypt during famine. At other times, he quarreled with his nephew Lot about grazing land. But always he returned to the hills and valleys of Canaan. He lived among the people of the land, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites. He made treaties, exchanged gifts, dug wells. He was no conqueror, only a sojourner, a passerby with a promise. That promise was strange, that he and Sarai, childless and aging, would bear a son, that his descendants would be as many as the stars, as the grains of sand by the sea. And time passed. Seasons folded over his tent like blankets. Trees grew and died. Herds wandered. Eventually, the promise began to take shape. Sarai, renamed Sarah, gave birth to Isaac, a quiet miracle, a child in old age, a beginning within a beginning. Abram became Abraham. Sarai became Sarah. Names changed because their story had changed. They were still wanderers, but no longer alone. Now they carried a legacy. Isaac grew. He married Rebekah. They bore twins, Jacob and Esau. And the whisper that once called to a man in Ur began to echo through generations. Jacob, the younger twin, would become the father of 12 sons. These sons would become the 12 tribes of Israel. But that part of the story lies ahead. For now, we stay with the patriarch, with Abraham, who spoke with messengers and bargained with heaven, who wept and laughed, built altars and dug wells, who wandered not to escape, but to become. He was buried in a cave in Hebron, beside Sarah. Isaac and Jacob would lie there too, their bones resting in the land that once barely noticed their arrival. The Canaanites still ruled the cities. The temples to foreign gods still smoked. But beneath it all, something had begun. Not a nation, not a kingdom, a family, a soft-spoken thread winding its way through the fabric of the land, a promise whispered from hilltop to valley. In time, it would grow louder. It would find its voice in law and song, in exile and return. But for now, it remained a whisper. When the wind passed over the land of Canaan in the days after Abraham, it brushed softly against tents and stone altars, whispered through olive groves, and carried with it the scent of barley fields and animal herds. In one of those tents slept a man with a complicated heart, a name given in birth but changed by destiny, Jacob. Jacob was born second, grasping the heel of his older twin, Esau. The name Jacob in that ancient tongue meant heel grabber, or perhaps more deeply, one who follows, one who strives. And so he did. His life was a long striving toward blessing, toward peace, toward understanding. He was raised in the household of Isaac, Abraham's quiet and steady son. But Jacob's life would not follow the straight paths of his father. It would twist like the riverbeds, win like the hills. He would outwit his brother for a birthright, deceive his father for a blessing, and flee into the wilderness with only a staff and a restless spirit. And it was in that wilderness, far from the fires of home, that Jacob dreamed. He laid his head on a stone, just a stone, and the heavens opened. A ladder stretched from earth to sky, angels ascending and descending, and above it all, a voice. I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. When he awoke, the stone became an altar, the place, once nameless, he called Bethel House of God. The journey was only beginning. Jacob traveled far to the land of his ancestors, to the house of Laban. There he worked for years to marry Rachel, whom he loved, and Leah, whom he learned to love. He raised flocks and children, wealth and worry. He became father to 12 sons and 1 daughter. Each child, each name, carried a thread that would one day become the woven garment of a people. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. These sons would one day form the tribes of Israel, but that name had not yet come. It came after a night of wrestling. Jacob was returning to Canaan, older now, burdened by riches and fears. He sent his household ahead, and he remained alone by the stream of Jabbok. And there in the dark he wrestled, with a stranger, with an angel, with God, no one knows. The struggle lasted till dawn. Sweat, pain, and silence, broken only by the sound of water and breath. When morning light crept across the sky, the stranger spoke. Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome. And so the name was given, not yet a nation, but a name, a beginning, Israel, one who struggles, one who prevails, one who does not let go. Jacob now Israelimed from that place, changed, marked by the night. His journey, always difficult, now turned toward meaning. He reunited with Esau, who forgave him. He returned to Bethel, where he had once dreamed. He buried Rachel in Bethlehem. He settled, wandered, and wept. His beloved son Joseph, born of Rachel, was sold into slavery by jealous brothers. Jacob believed him dead. The grief was deep. Years passed. Drought came. Famine swept the land. And in the strange turns of fate, Jacob's sons found themselves in Egypt, begging for grain. There, seated in power, was Joseph, not dead, but risen governor of the land, clothed in linen, wise beyond his years. There was reunion. There were tears. Jacob, old and astonished, came down to Egypt with all his household. 70 souls, they say, a family of shepherds settling in the land of Pharaohs. He blessed his sons, each with words that echoed prophecy. He laid hands on Joseph's children, Ephraim and Manasseh, who would carry their own legacy. And then Jacob died. His body was carried back to Canaan, to the cave of Machpelah, beside Abraham and Isaac, a lineage now 3 generations deep, a promise still far off, yet pulsing quietly beneath the surface. From one man had come a family. From a family, a people would rise. But for now, they were still a household, a flickering lamp in the land of Egypt. The land of Canaan slept without them. Its hills breathed quietly. Its altars stood. And far below its soil, the bones of dreamers rested. Beneath the gaze of sandstone cliffs and golden desert light, the Nile carved its eternal path. Crops flourished in its shadow. Temples rose to honor gods with falcon heads and sun crowns. Egypt, ancient and proud, pulsed with power and myth. And within its embrace, in the fertile lands of Goshen, a foreign family took root. They came as honored guest shepherds from Canaan, brought by famine, led by reunion. 70 souls, it is said, descended with Jacob into Egypt, a household, a beginning. They were not yet a nation, not yet enslaved. They lived as a family under the protection of Joseph, the dreamer turned vizier. Joseph, once sold by his brothers, now stood beside Pharaoh himself. He had saved the land from famine, interpreted visions, overseen grain stores. His name was known. His word carried weight. So his family was welcomed. They lived in Goshen, a region of green pastures on the edge of Egyptian civilization, separate but safe. They kept their flocks. They raised children. They told stories under the stars of Abraham and Isaac, of Jacob and the ladder, of promises made in far-off lands. Time passed. Generations turned like the slow rise and fall of the Nile. Joseph died. His brothers died. The family multiplied. Sons became clans. Clans became tribes. And a new Pharaoh rose, one who knew not Joseph. He saw the people of Israel not as guests, but as threat, foreigners, too numerous, too strong. Come, he said to his counselors, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will become more numerous and, in the event of war, join our enemies. And so, slowly, the welcome turned to warning. The Israelites were pressed into labor. At first, it was work with reward, then work with little reward, then bondage. They built store cities Pithom and Ramses. They molded bricks from mud and straw. They hauled stone in the heat of day. The work was endless, their hands calloused, their backs bent. And yet they grew. The more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied. The Pharaoh feared them still. He ordered midwives to kill their sons at birth. But the midwives were brave. They feared a higher power. They let the boys live. So Pharaoh turned to the people. Every Hebrew boy that is born must be thrown into the Nile. And the people of Israel groaned under the weight of sorrow. Yet in the shadows a baby was born, a boy. His mother placed him in a basket of reeds, coated it with pitch, and set it adrift upon the Nile. The river that gave life now carried hope. The basket floated to where Pharaoh's daughter bathed. She opened it. The child cried. Her heart stirred. She named him Moses. He would grow up in the palace of the oppressor, wearing linen instead of wool, learning the language of kings. But his blood remembered. One day he saw an Egyptian strike a Hebrew slave. He intervened. He killed the Egyptian. He fled into the wilderness. There, far from Pharaoh's court, among the sands of Midian, he found a new life. He married. He shepherded. He climbed mountains. And one day, from a bush that burned but was not consumed, he heard a voice. I have seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have come down to rescue them. Moses resisted. He stammered. He doubted. But he returned. The time of sojourning was ending. The quiet decades in Goshen, the songs by the fire, the whispered stories of Abraham, all of it now pulsed with urgency. The people were still in Egypt, but Egypt no longer held them gently. They were no longer guests. They were slaves. Yet even in bondage, their identity formed. They remembered. They named. They waited. And in their waiting, they became something more than a family. They became a people forged in labor. A people refined by longing. Sleep now. Let the Nile waters calm your thoughts. Let the hush of Goshen settle like fog across memory. Let the waiting of a people drift over you like sand, for soon they will rise. But tonight they are still. The sun rose over Egypt like it always did, slow, golden, indifferent. But in the hearts of a weary people, something stirred. The wind felt different. The days, though long, now pulsed with quiet urgency. They were still bound in chains, still pressed into labor. Yet a whisper passed from hut to hut, from family to family. Something was about to change. It had begun with a man, Moses, who returned from the wilderness not with an army, but with words. He came to Pharaoh, that towering figure wrapped in linen and pride, and said the unthinkable, "Let my people go." Pharaoh laughed. And then he refused. But the voice that had spoken to Moses in fire and wind did not fall silent. Plague after plague swept over Egypt. Water turned to blood. Frogs swarmed the land. Dust rose as gnats. Flies darkened the sky. Livestock perished. Boils blistered. Hail fell like fire. Locusts devoured. Darkness stretched over the land for 3 days. And then came the final night. A lamb was slain in every Hebrew home. Its blood brushed across doorposts. Bread was baked in haste. Bitter herbs laid out. Shoes laced. Staffs in hand. And at midnight, the firstborn of Egypt died. A cry rose in the land so deep, so wide, it seemed the earth itself trembled. And Pharaoh, broken, whispered the words long awaited, "Go." And so they went, not as individuals, but as a people. They gathered under the moon, by the thousands. Children clung to mothers. Elders leaned on canes. Carts rolled slowly, oxen and sheep trailing behind. Gold and silver, hastily given by Egyptians, jingled in sacks. They were strangers in a familiar land, and now they were leaving it behind. The desert greeted them with wind and silence. Moses led, but a pillar of cloud stood ahead. By night, it turned to fire. A quiet Miraculano thunder, no fanfare, just light. They reached the sea, and Pharaoh changed his mind. Chariots thundered behind. The people panicked. The sea blocked the way. But Moses stood firm. He lifted his staff. The waters parted, and they walked through. Walls of water rose on each side, but they walked not as heroes, but as people with no other choice. They crossed. The sea closed. Egypt faded behind them. The wilderness lay ahead. It was not the end of trouble. The desert tested them. Hunger gnawed. Thirst burned. They doubted. They complained. Yet manna fell in the morning. Quail arrived with the wind. Water flowed from rock. And at Sinai they paused. The mountain loomed dark and terrible. Thunder cracked. Smoke rose. And Moses climbed alone. He returned with tablets of stone, 10 words etched in divine hand. A covenant. This was not merely a journey anymore. It was transformation. No longer slaves. Not yet a nation, but becoming. They would wander 40 years. They would bury the old and raise the young. They would learn obedience and rebellion, fear and faith. And always the promise ahead. A land, a home. The land once promised to Abraham. A land flowing with milk and honey. Still distant, still unseen. But now more than a dream. A destination. They were Israel now, not just in name, but in soul. A people marked by deliverance, wandering, and hope. The land behind them was Egypt, a place of pyramids and bondage, bitter herbs and buried bones. The land ahead was a whisper, a hope, a promise passed from parent to child beneath woven tents. Between them lay the wilderness, dry, wide, and waiting. The people of Israel did not march out of Egypt like a conquering army. They shuffled forward, hungry and blinking in the light of freedom. They carried bundles and memories, infants and fear. They followed a cloud by day, a fire by night. They followed Moses. But the desert does not make things easy. It stretches the soul as it stretches the land. It teaches slowly. It reveals who we are when there is no city, no harvest, no place to hide. The people murmured, "Why did you bring us here to die?" They remembered Egypt not as it was, but as they wished it had been pots of meat, bread without toil, homes with walls. But there, in that emptiness, the lessons began. In the morning manna, thin flakes, white like frost, sweet like honey, they gathered just enough, no more, no less. It melted with the sun. Quail came in the evening, water from a rock, a rhythm of trust. Every seventh day, no manna, rest, a strange command. They had been slaves. Now they were told to pause, to breathe, to remember. They moved from camp to camp, Rephidim, Kadesh, Mount Sinai. Their journey was not straight. It curved like questions. At Sinai they stopped. The mountain loomed. Thunder, fire, a cloud thick with meaning. Moses climbed. The people waited. And from that summit, words came down. Not just laws, but identity. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. 10 words. Boundaries for a people becoming something more than a crowd. No other gods. No idols. Honor your parents. Do not murder. Do not steal. Do not lie. Do not covet. The tablets were stone, but the meaning lived. Still, the people faltered. Moses lingered on the mountain too long. Fear crept in. They asked Aaron for something they could see. And so, a golden calf, dancing, singing, forgetting. Moses returned. His face shone. His heart broke. He smashed the tablets. But even this was not the end. The tablets were made anew. A tabernacle was built cloth, wood, gold. Portable holiness, a tent for the divine to dwell among them. Inside, an ark, a box of acacia wood covered in gold. Inside it, the tablets, a jar of manna, Aaron's staff. They were still in the desert, but now they carried their center with them. Time passed. Years stretched. The old generation withered like grass in heat. New children ran among the tents, never knowing Egypt, only stories of bricks and blood. They quarreled with Moses. They doubted. But also, they learned. They learned the laws. Laws about eating and resting. Laws about justice and mercy. Laws about fields, families, and festivals. They learned that holiness was not a feeling, but a practice, a way of walking. They learned to count time differently. 7 days, 7 weeks, 7 years. They learned that land must rest, just as people do, that debts are not forever, that slaves must go free. In the desert, they became more than wanderers. They became a people. They mourned Miriam. They mourned Aaron. They gathered at the edge of the promised land. Moses climbed a final mountain. He looked across the Jordan. He saw the hills and valleys, the olive trees and vineyards not yet planted. He did not cross. He died there, quietly, buried by a mystery. Joshua would lead them now. But the desert had done its work. A people once enslaved had become a people set apart, not because of power, not because of wealth, but because they remembered. The Jordan River moved slowly in spring. It swelled with melted snows from the north, its waters muddy and deep, winding through reeds and thyme. The people of Israel stood at its banks, feet pressing into soft earth, hearts pressing into old hopes. They were on the edge of land, of memory, of becoming. Behind them, wilderness, 40 years of wandering, graves scattered across dunes, lessons etched in dust. Before them, the land promised to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, a land described by prophets and dreamers, a land flowing, they said, with milk and honey, a land already lived in, farmed, fenced, and fought over. The Jordan was no sea, but it was wide enough, and the people stood in silence. Then Joshua, Moses' successor, stepped forward. He did not carry a sword. He carried memory. He instructed the priests to lift the Ark of the Covenant. That golden box, the symbol of presence, law, and story, was carried ahead. And as their feet touched the edge of water, the river stopped. Piled in a heap, far upstream, the water held still, and dry ground appeared. And the people crossed. The wind whispered through the tall grasses. The air smelled of damp stone and flowering things, and every step forward was a step into something old and new all at once. They set foot in the land. Canaan, not empty, not waiting, but already alive. Cities stood beyond the hills, walls thick with history, armies trained in courtyards, fields tilled by hands that had never left. And now the people of Israel were called not just to remember, to live. First, they built a monument, 12 stones taken from the riverbed, one for each tribe, stacked high beside the Jordan, so that future generations would ask, "What do these stones mean?" And parents would answer, "Here, we crossed on dry ground." Then they renewed the covenant. Knives were drawn, and the men were circumcised, a painful re-entry into identity. The manna stopped. They ate from the land, roasted grain, fresh bread, olives perhaps. For the first time in a generation, their food came from soil and sweat. And then came Jericho. High walls, heavy gates, a city watching. Joshua did not lay siege. He led a procession. Once a day for 6 days, they circled the city. Priests blew trumpets. The ark followed. No shouts, no weapons. On the 7th day, they marched 7 times. Then came a shout, and the walls fell, not by might, not by strategy, but by something older. And the city fell. But not everything. A woman Rahab had sheltered the spies. Her house, built into the wall, remained. A red cord hung from her window, a symbol of protection, of trust. Her family survived. Her name would echo through genealogies. The conquest had begun, yet it was not swift. There were battles. Ai, where overconfidence led to defeat. Gibeon, where deceit led to alliance. Cities fell, kings fled, lands were claimed, divided, measured. But the land did not give itself easily. The tribes spread out: Judah in the south, Ephraim in the center, Dan along the coast, Naphtali in the north. Some drove out inhabitants, others lived among them. The land shaped the people as much as the people claimed the land. They built altars, they planted vineyards, they dug wells. They argued, they remembered. At Shechem, Joshua gathered the people. He recited their story from Abraham to Egypt, from plagues to promises. And he asked them, "Choose this day whom you will serve." The people answered, "We will serve the Lord." A covenant renewed again, a circle closed, a generation completed. Joshua died. He was buried in the hill country. The tribes returned to their portions, and for a time there was rest. But memory fades quickly. The land was not yet united. The people were many tribes, not one kingdom. And as the book of Joshua closed, the book of Judges would open with new voices, new leaders, new trials. But in this chapter, we pause. The Jordan flows again. The stones still stand. The land no longer waits. And the Pepuan slaves, then wanderer shave, become something more. The land was theirs, yet it was not at peace. The Canaanite cities still glimmered under the sun, some defiant, others weary. The high places were still sacred to older gods. The groves still thick with whispers to Asherah and Baal, and the people of Israel now scattered by tribe, by field, by family settled into the soil like seeds not yet rooted. There was no king in Israel. Each tribe lived by its own rhythm. The boundaries of inheritance were loosely kept, loosely remembered. Judah farmed the hill country. Dan fought for a place along the coast. Ephraim held the center. Benjamin lingered near Jerusalem, which still belonged to the Jebusites. And among the people, two forces grew, forgetfulness and fear. They forgot the covenant. Not all at once, but slowly, like dust settling into creases, like a morning fog that never lifts. They forgot the voice that thundered on Sinai, the fire that burned but did not consume. They forgot the taste of manna, the path through the sea. They looked around and saw gods with faces, shrines with incense, festivals with wine. And so they followed. They married into the nations around them. They made peace where there had been commands to resist. They adapted, they absorbed, and in doing so, they drifted. But the land was not quiet. It pushed back. Invaders came not as armies in shining armor, but as raiders. The Midianites swept in like locusts, stealing grain and livestock. The Philistines, fierce and cunning, pressed from the coast. The Ammonites rose from the east. Trouble came, and with it, awakening. In those days, when trouble grew unbearable, the people cried out, and judges rose. Not judges like in courts, but leaders, warriors, prophets, deliverers. Not kings, but chosen for a time, for a moment, for a people in need. Othniel, first of them, rose from Judah. He fought, won peace, and faded into the land. Ehud, the left-handed, hid a dagger beneath his cloak and slew a king in silence. Deborah, a prophetess beneath the palm tree, called forth Barak and led the people in song. Gideon, a farmer trembling in a winepress, became a general. He tore down altars. He tested God with dew and fleece. He led with 300 men carrying torches in clay jars. Each judge brought peace. Each peace was short. The pattern repeated. Forgetfulness, oppression, crying out, deliverance, and back again. The land was not yet unified. The tribes fought not only outsiders, but sometimes each other. Jephthah made a vow he could not take back. Samson, wild and strong, loved a woman more than his mission. His strength undone by hair and trust. But in these stories, some tragic, some triumphant, the people continued. They were not a nation, not yet. But they had memory. They had the ark. They had elders and Levites scattered among the tribes, telling stories by firelight, singing old songs, reciting the Shema. They had grain to harvest, lambs to raise, children to teach. They had the land, and slowly, through the centuries of judges, the idea of unity took root, not just as neighbors, but as kin, not just as tribes, but as one people with many voices. Still, the longing grew, a longing for a king, but that is for another chapter. The stars over Shiloh flickered quietly, watching a people restless beneath their light. The Ark of the Covenant rested in a tabernacle of curtains, worn by travel and time. A boy named Samuel lay near it, wrapped in a simple cloak, ears open even in sleep. And the voice of the Lord, long silent, called him by name. Samuel. He rose, uncertain, thought it was Eli, the aging priest, but it was not. It was something older, deeper voice that once called to Abraham, once thundered from Sinai, now speaking in whispers. Samuel would grow into a prophet. His name, meaning God has heard, would carry authority. He would walk between tribes, judge disputes, offer sacrifices. But more than anything, he would listen. The people came to him not in ones or twos, but as a crowd, as a nation yearning for change. Give us a king, they said, like the other nations. Samuel, grieved, prayed. And the voice came again. Listen to them. It is not you they have rejected, but me as their king. Still, he warned them. A king would take sons for chariots, daughters for perfume, fields for taxes. He would rule with power, not always with justice. But the people insisted. And so Saul, tall, broad-shouldered, shy in youth, chosen from Benjamin, the smallest tribe, he was found hiding among baggage when called to lead. Samuel anointed him with oil. Poured upon his head, it dripped like destiny, the first king. Saul reigned from Gibeah. His rule began with promise. He led in battle, rallied tribes, pushed back Philistines. But shadows grew quickly. He grew impatient, offered sacrifices in Samuel's absence, disobeyed commands, feared people more than principle. The voice that once called Samuel now spoke again. I regret that I have made Saul king. And so Samuel wept, not for the loss of power, but the sadness of a path gone wrong. He visited Bethlehem. There, among the sons of Jesse, stood a shepherd boy with bright eyes and a quiet courage. David, anointed in secret. The oil again flowed, not upon a warrior but a musician. David returned to the fields, to sheep, to solitude. Saul continued to rule, but his peace unraveled. A spirit troubled him. He called for music. David played the lyre. Strings calmed storms. The king did not know the boy was his successor. David grew in favor. He slew Goliath, the giant of Gath, with a sling and a stone. The people sang, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. Saul grew jealous, angry, afraid. He pursued David, hunted him through caves, across hills. David fled, hid, spared Saul's life more than once. The king became a ghost of the promise he once held. The Philistines returned, the battle pressed hard. Saul sought counsel from silence, and in despair from a medium, a forbidden act. On Mount Gilboa he fell on his own sword. His sons died with him, his armor lost, his crown taken. The first king, tall and tragic, lay beneath the sun, and David mourned. He tore his clothes, wept, wrote a song, how the mighty have fallen. But now the path cleared. David would rise. Not yet, but soon. The sun rose over Hebron with the quiet light of a new beginning. After years of hiding, years of lyre playing and spear dodging, Years of wilderness exile and whispered anointings, David was no longer only a shepherd or fugitive. Now he was king first of Judah and then of all Israel. 7 years in Hebron, then a move north to a city that had never fully belonged to any tribe, Jerusalem, the Jebusite stronghold. He took it, not with fire and fury, but with strategy and swiftness. A city on a hill, a center, a symbol. David made it his capital, the city of David, ancient and new. He brought the ark carried not on oxen this time, but on shoulders, with singing and dancing and care. The streets echoed with tambourines, with harps, with voices raised not in war, but in worship. He danced before the Lord, wild, unashamed. And when his wife Michal looked on with scorn, David only spun more freely. I will become even more undignified than this, he said. For David was not only a king of battles, he was a king of songs. The psalms poured from him when he was joyful, afraid, grateful, broken. Words became refuge, melody became prayer. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. His power grew. He defeated the Philistines, Moabites, Edomites, Ammonites. He expanded borders, collected tribute, unified tribes that once squabbled like siblings. But even kings are not without cracks. On a rooftop, one evening, David looked across the city and saw a woman bathing. Her name was Bathsheba. He desired. He summoned. She came. And from that moment, the story turned dark. She was married. Her husband, Uriah, was loyal, noble, away at war. David sent orders. Put Uriah at the front. Withdraw. And Uriah died. David took Bathsheba as his own. The child came. And then the prophet came. Nathan. He told a story of a rich man stealing a poor man's lamb. David burned with anger. You are the man, Nathan said. And David broke. He fasted. He wept. He wrote, Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love. The child died, but David lived. He grew older, wiser, weaker. His house, once unified, began to fracture. Amnon, his son, violated his sister Tamar. Absalom, her brother, waited, then killed Amnon, then fled, then returned, then rebelled. David wept again. He fled his own city, barefoot, head covered. His loyalists followed. Absalom claimed the throne, but pride and strategy undid him. His hair, long and proud, caught in the branches of a tree as he fled battle. He hung there. Joab, David's general, struck him down. And David mourned louder than ever before. O Absalom, my son, my son. He returned to Jerusalem, restored, but not whole. In old age his strength faded. A new question rose. Who would follow him? Another son, Adonijah, claimed kingship early, but David, guided by prophets and priests, anointed Solomon, Bathsheba's son. The boy who once toddled through palace corridors now stood beside the aging king, and David gave him a charge. Be strong, be a man, walk in God's ways. Then he slept. The king who had danced and sinned, prayed and wept, conquered and composed he, was gathered to his ancestors. He was buried in the city of David, and still today the songs remain.